Good morning. I am Molly Brinkerhoff, today's worship associate. Welcome to this sunshiny, beautiful, non-windy May day. I am glad we are all together virtually with Reverend Kevin, myself, and Andrew White. We are coming to you from our church sanctuary. We do have a few weekly announcements. First, if you are able to, please sign into the chat box at the right of your screen. This will let us know who is joining us. We will be having joys, concerns, and sorrows today, and if you didn't email them to the worship team, now is the time to put them in the chat box so a candle can be lit for you. Please indicate if it is a sorrow, concern, or joy. It has been noted that new people have been joining us for both our live Sunday service and from our website. If you are new and would like to get on our email newsletter, please call or email the Church Administrative Office and leave a message with your email address. If you would like to talk to someone about the church, please contact the office. We are so glad you are joining us. While we are no longer having an offertory time during the service, it is still important. We would gratefully receive pledges and any other donations to support us. Just go to the website to click on the Give button, and thank you for your support. We will now move into the sacred time of worship. A quote from Thich Nhat Hanh: "Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor." So with that thought, let's breathe easily. Inhale and exhale as I ring the peace bowl 3 times. We will begin our service with our prelude. We recite our church covenant together to remind us who we are despite being apart. May we root ourselves in the values of this faith and this church. Please join me in reciting our church covenant. Love is the spirit of this community and service its law. This is our great covenant to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We will now be lighting our chalice. If you have a candle or chalice available, please light yours with us. And today's chalice lighting comes from our hymnal, number 447. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us. By Albert Schweitzer.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning comes from the Reverend Wayne Arneson. Spirit of life, we enter into this season of Memorial Day surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses. We remember, first of all, the women and men who are currently serving in the armed forces, and we pray for their safe return. We also acknowledge that there are women and men who will not return, as we grieve their passing in the daily paper. We pause to honor their service and their sacrifice. We also pause this hour to give thanks for all the women and men who have served in the nation's armed forces. Those who have not served cannot fully imagine the experience of war, but we do know war's aftermath and the toll it can take on the human heart. This day remembers and acknowledges loss, and so do we remember those whom we have loved and lost. We hold their names and their faces in our mind's eye. We recall the gifts they gave us through the strength of their being, the depth of their love, the courage of their dying, and the fullness of their living. In the holy quiet of this hour, their names surround us, and they live with us in blessed memory. May we remain together in silence as a tribute to all that they have meant to us. I invite you now to join in singing our opening hymn, number 160, Far Too Long by Fear Divided.
Far too long by fear divided, we have settled with the sword quarrels which should be decided by the reconciling word. Now the nations are united, though as yet in name alone, and the distant goal is sighted, which the prophet souls have shown. May at last we cease from warring, barriers of hate remove, and earth's riches freely sharing, found the dynasty of love.
Today's Time for All Ages is Pink and Say by Patricia Palacio, read by Elizabeth Cloyati, Director of Lifespan Faith Development. Pink and Say. To the memory of Pincus Eiley. When Sheldon Russell Curtis told this story to his daughter, Rosa, she kept it every word in her heart and was to retell it many times over in her long lifetime. Sheldon had been injured in a fierce battle and was left for dead in a muddy, blood-soaked pasture somewhere in Georgia. He was a mere lad of 15. He lay there for 2 days, by his reckoning, only to slip into unconsciousness and fever. He was rescued from this field by another lad who had also been separated from his company. I will tell it in his own words as nearly as I can. I watched the sun edge toward the center of the sky above me. I was hurt real bad. For almost a year I'd been in this man's war, the war between the states. Being just a lad, I was wishing I was home. My leg burned, and I was angry from the lead ball that was lodged in it just above my knee. I felt sleepy, and everything would go black. Then I'd wake up again. I wanted to go back to our farm in Ohio, and sometimes when I'd fall into one of them strange sleeps, I'd be there with my ma, tasting baking powder biscuits fresh out of her wood stove. Then I heard a voice. For a moment I thought I was fever dreaming, but then I felt strong hands touch my brow and splash water on my face. "Being here, boy, means you gotta be dead," the voice said as he gave me a drink from his kit. "Where you hit? 'Cause if it's a belly hit, I gotta leave you here," he said. I had never seen a man like him so close before. His skin was the color of polished mahogany. He was flying Union colors like me. My age, maybe. His voice was soothing and his help was good. "Hit in the leg," I told him. "Not bad if it don't go green." "Can you put weight on it?" he asked as he pulled me to my feet. "We gotta keep moving. If we stay in one spot, marauders will find us. They're riding drag and looking for wounded." Next thing I remember was collapsing in a heap on the ground and rocking with the pain in my leg. Everything started to go black. Then I remember him pulling me up on his back. I heard him say, "Lord have mercy, child, you as bad off as I am. I'll tote you. I can't rightly leave you here." I remember being pulled and carried and stumbling. I remember hard branches snapping back in my face and mouths full of dirt as we hit the ground to keep from being seen. I remember slogging through streams, hauling up small bluffs, and belly crawling through dry fields. I remember these things in half sleep-like, but I do remember being carried for a powerful long way. Then fever must have took me good, 'cause I could feel a cool, sweet-smelling quilt next to my face. Soft, gentle hands were stroking my head with a cool, wet rag cloth. "Look at that morning that's a-comin'," a woman's voice said as she spooned oat porridge into me. "Do your mama know what a beautiful baby boy she has?" "Where am I? Is this heaven?" I asked. She tossed her head and laughed. "No, child, Pincus brung you home to me. Don't you remember?" The mahogany child, I thought. "Both you children been on the run for days, and a miracle of God Almighty brung you both here. Yes, indeed, child, a miracle." I remember thinking, could this war have been so close to this lad's home? I couldn't imagine having a war right in his backyard. I looked over and saw him looking out the window light. "Guess you don't remember much," he said. "I'm Pincus Eiley, fought with the 48th Colored. Found you after I got lost from my company." "My name is Sheldon Curtis," I said weakly. "This is my mother, sweet Momo Bay," he said as she smiled at me. "Lord, Lord, I never thought I'd see my dear boy again," she said as she hugged him. "I've been getting along, though, Pincus. Warm things got left in the big house when the family left. Dry goods, too. The rest I've been getting from the woods. There's a freshwater spring. Still have some chickens. Even got an old cow out back that still gives." "Then have you been alone all alone here?" Pincus asked his mother. "Where is everybody?" "Your daddy runned off to fight a month ago. All the hands and their children runned off out of harm's way. But I stayed. I prayed to the Lord every day. My prayers were surely answered, 'cause he brought my baby back here to stay," she said as her face beamed. "You ain't never going to leave your mama again, are you, child?" she said softly. Pincus looked troubled and didn't answer. "I'm going down to the stream and pound these clothes of yours," she said as she readied to leave us. "If you hear marauders coming, get for the root cellar door. Stay down there till they gone. That's what I've been doing." "Marauders here?" Pincus said with alarm. "They've seen there's nothing here for them, child. Nothing." As soon as she left us, Pincus sank to my bedside. "Sheldon, boy," he whispered, "as soon as you heal up, we've got to get away from here. We are putting Momo Bay in great danger by being here. If they come and find that she's been holding troopers, then his voice trailed off. We gotta get back to our outfits if we can find them. You mean back to the war? I asked. I must have gone pale as he went on to say, it's only the only way, ain't it? Then he looked at me. Sheldon, you all right? You look bothered, he said as he eased me back. You can call me Say, I said. Everybody in my family calls me Say, not Sheldon. I expect you're my family now. Near enough, Say, near enough, he said as he chucked the blanket under my feet. You can call me Pink, he said softly as he smiled. For the next week, Momo Bay fed us up both good. Raw milk and cornbread never tasted so good in all my born days. It were the first time in months my victuals didn't have any mealy worms in it. She saw to it that I tried to walk a little every day. So that's mean-looking leg don't go stiff on you and cripple up, she'd say. This place wasn't much different from our farmhouse in Ohio. More poor, maybe, but it smelled the same. Like pine boards and good cooking. A mess of beans with salt pork, cornbread, greens, and onions. While we slept, she sat near us, stoked the fire, and watched over us. Never thought I'd feel safe enough to sleep deep again. My mother and Kalo, my father, jumped the broom on this very spot, Pink said as he walked me on my first day outdoors. And that there was the master's house, Master Eiley. Pink spoke quietly as he helped me along. How come you have his last name, I asked. Boy, when you owned, you ain't got no name of your own. Even Kalo had to take that name. As we rested under the willow tree, Pink asked me about my family back home. Got one brother still at home to run the place for Pa, I answered. What was your outfit again? Pink asked. He'd asked me before. Ohio 24th. I carried the staff. Wasn't supposed to carry a gun, but then so many died, even us boys had to carry after so many were slaughtered like hogs. Least you got to carry. In the 48th, we couldn't have guns at first. We fought with sticks and hammers and sledges. Can you imagine not trusting us with our own fight? I couldn't imagine such a thing. Then when they did finally give us muskets, they were from the Mexican-American War. Those muskets jammed and misfired. Then how, in God's name, can you want to go back? I asked. 'Cause it's my fight, Say. Ain't it yours, too? If we don't fight, then who will? I had no answer for him, but God forgive me, I didn't ever want to ever go back to it. After a few more days, I could walk a little steadier, but still needed help. Pink took me out by the big house and walked me through it. Weren't much left of it, really. It was mostly burned out. Master Eiley had a library full of books right here, he said. He taught me to read, even though it was against the law. He must have been a good man, I said. More bad than good, Say. Sometimes I think he just liked being read to. There was this book of poetry, Say, that was this thick. Every night I'd read out loud to him from that book. I blessed this house because of all those beautiful books, but I cursed it too for what it stood for. We walked a bit further. To be born a slave is a heap of trouble, Say, but after Eiley taught me to read, even though he owned my person, I knew that nobody ever could really own me. You feel hot, Pink, I said. Lord, I think you are as sick as I am. Let me fetch you back to the house. I'll be fine, boy, just a little tired, that's all. I'll be ready to fight, though. I'll be ready to fight. That night, after we ate, Momo Bay came back to the table with a worn old Bible. She was so happy. My heart ached at the thought of telling her we'd be leaving soon. Master Eiley showed him how paper talks. Show him, Pink, she said. He took out a pair of spectacles from his pocket and opened the Bible to the Psalms of David and started to read. His voice was steady and had such wonder. Just hearing them words made pictures come into my head. I surely do wish I could read, I announced to them without thinking. When Pink saw I was ashamed, he took my hand. I'll teach you, Say, some one day. I'll teach you. I could feel my face flushing up. Then I spoke. I done something important, I announced. Of course you have, child. Of course you have, his mother said. I touched Mr. Lincoln's hand. It were near Washington. We were quartered there just before Bull Run. The president himself were shaking everyone's hands. And I just put my hand right out. And he took it? Pink asked. Yep, he took it, I answered. Now there's a sign, ain't it? He said, smiling broadly. Touch my hand, Pink. Now you can say you touched the hand that shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln. Next best thing to touching him, Momo Bay said in wonder. Most of the next day, Pink was studying an old map. Marauders don't fan out further than 30 miles or so from their camps. If they come here, then their units must be that close. We got to get south of the river. See here, Say, that's where my troops were headed. We can meet up with them about here, I figure. Meet up with who? You ain't leaving, his mother's voice caught as she came out upon us. Now, my mother, you knew we couldn't stay here. You had to know that, he said as he tried to calm her. No, no, my babies, my dear babies, she cried. She was inconsolable for a time, then she sat still and afeared as she just listened. Mother, this war has to be won, or this sickness that has taken this land will never stop. Pink always called slavery the sickness when we talked. We have to go. He knelt at her feet. By the look that came into her eyes, she'd known that this day was coming. I could feel my breathing catch. My chest was heavy. My hands were sweating and I felt sick at my stomach. I knew that I had to tell Pink something. I just didn't know how. That night I couldn't sleep. What's wrong, child? Momo Bay said from her chair. I don't want to go back, I blurted out. I know, child, she said. Of course you don't. You don't understand. I took up and run away from my unit. I was hit when I was running. I sobbed so hard my ribs hurt. I'm a coward and a deserter. She looked at the fire and said nothing for the longest time. Then her voice covered my cries. You ain't nothing of the kind. You a child. A child. Of course you scared. Ain't nobody that ain't. I'm not brave like Pink. I'm not brave. Child, being brave don't mean you ain't afeared. Don't you know that? I don't want to die. They's things worse than death, child, but you got nothing to fear. You are here now, and I'm hugging you up. You're going to be an old man some day. When it is your time, the sweet Lord'll send a hummingbird to fly your soul to heaven. Now you ain't as feared of hummingbirds, are you? Her words brought me sweet sleep. That night I dreamt of hummingbirds and green pastures full of sunlight and wildflowers. The next morning we mustered up to leave. We packed cornbread, salt pork, and dried beans. I would have done just about anything to stay, but my place was to go with Pink. I owed him that. Just as we were making the last sweep of the place, making sure that there were no signs of us ever being there, we heard wild screams and shrieks coming from the woods. Marauders, Pink said as he grabbed a piece of wood for a club. Momo Bay took it from him. Get to the root cellar. They ain't got no truck with an old dark woman. You get to that cellar, you hear? We didn't like it, but then she pushed us. Hurry, afore they're here. She lifted the root cellar door and shoved us in. Don't come out till I tell you. We heard the porch steps creak as she ran from the cabin. She's drawing them off, Pink whispered. When the marauders came in, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it up there above us. There was a terrible commotion as they ransacked, looking for food. Then there was silence. A single shot echoed through the trees outside. We waited for a sign. They let out a war whoop as they thundered off. We waited for a sign from Momo Bay, but it didn't come. Finally, we climbed out and ran outside only to see Momo Bay lying just beyond the porch. We put you in their way by staying here, Pink cried as he rocked her in his arms. Her eyes were looking in a faraway place as he closed them. Your son loves you, Momo Bay. Your son loves you. He sobbed as he kissed her. We both held her hand until there was no more warmth in it. After we buried her under the willow tree, we set out. Pink figured we were a 3 days' walk from Union troops. He watched the movement of the sun. Her words still rang in my heart, her words about being brave. My steps were as sure now as they had ever been since the war started. We walked in the open as clear as a country stroll until the morning of the second day. Then we knew we were being followed. Take these, Pink said as he took his spectacles from his pocket. If they catch me with them, there'll be trouble for sure. When they caught up to us, one yelled at me, Where you going with that darky, boy? I was afraid to answer because of my northern accent. It would dead sure give us away. Boy, what outfit you part of? Their leader barked. I couldn't answer. You Union boy? One jeered as he pulled my uniform from my knapsack. No, I ain't no Yankee. I got that from a dead one, I sputtered, trying to convince him. That was when we were grabbed. My words had given us away. We were prisoners of the Confederate Army. We were held up in a barn that night. Pink shivered with fever. I held him as he had done for me. The next morning we were thrown into a boxcar. We rode for what seemed 2 days, stopping many times. When the door slid open, the daylight was blinding. We were loaded into a buckboard and taken through town. The townsfolk looked hard at us. All they had left for us was mean looks and a heap of hate. We jarred to a stop in front of gates that marked the entrance to a stockade. It says Andersonville, Pink whispered. My heart stopped. I had heard of this place. It was one of the worst of the Confederate camps. When we were pulled from the buckboard, we fell hard to the ground. No, no, I begged as they pulled us both along. Because of his fever, Pink stumbled and fell. They dragged him along with such meanness. He did not protest until they forced us in different directions. Then he reached for me and said, Let me touch the hand that touched Mr. Lincoln, say, just one last time. I watched tears fill his eyes and cleaved my hand to his until they wrenched us apart. They smote him and dragged him away from me. He looked back at me and tried to say something more, but they crossed his back with knotted hemp and pushed him along. Sheldon Russell Curtis was released from Andersonville prison some months later, weighing no more than 78 pounds. Andersonville was built to hold only 10,000 prisoners, but by the end of the war it held 33,000 soldiers. There was no fresh water, no shelter, and no food. 13,000 men and boys died of starvation and dysentery. Sheldon Curtis returned to his home and recovered. He settled in Berlin Township in Saranac, Michigan. He married Abigail N. Barnard and fathered 7 children. He became a grandfather and a great-grandfather during his long lifetime. He died a very old man in 1924. Pincus Eiley never returned home. For him, there was to be no wife, no children, nor grandchildren to remember him. It was told he was hanged within hours after he was taken into Andersonville. His body was thrown into a lime pit. I know this story to be true because Sheldon Russell Curtis told his daughter, Rosa. Rosa Curtis Stowell told it to her daughter, Estella. Estella Stowell Barber, in turn, told her son, William. He then told me, his daughter, Patricia. When my father finished this story, he put out his hand and said, "This is the hand that has touched the hand, that has touched the hand, that shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln." This book serves as a written memory of Pincus Eiley, since there are no living descendants to do this for him. When you read this, before you put this book down, say his name out loud and vow to remember him always. Pincus Eiley. The end.
For years, the sharing of joys and concerns and sorrows has been our enduring ritual. It is a time in our congregation where everyone has an opportunity to share a major event in their lives so that we can all be uplifted by our Unitarian Universalist community. I will be reading the joys, concerns, or sorrows that were put into the chat box, and Reverend Kevin will light a candle. So we have just one joy, and it's from Victoria McDonald. My brother finally had laparoscopic surgery that repaired his intestines and is home and able to eat small meals. We are really happy that your brother's doing well. I also light a candle for myself with a concern. Having come back from Yellowstone, I would like to light a candle for all the rangers and all the workers that will be in Yellowstone for the next season. I think it's going to be a big challenge. So I'd light a candle for them. Do we have anything else? Okay. And then we light one additional candle for all those joys, concerns, and sorrows we hold in our hearts and are unable to share today. So stay healthy and strong, members and friends. Our UU community lifts up its love for each and every one of you.
I have 2 readings this morning, which are poems written by veterans of the First World War, and they reflected on the conflict in slightly different tones. The first is probably familiar to you. It's In Flanders Fields by John McCrae, written in May 1915. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. The second poem is On Passing the Meenen Gate by Siegfried Sassoon. For some context, the Meenen Gate is a memorial built in Ypres, Belgium, to honor the missing dead soldiers of the British Commonwealth during the First World War. Sassoon experienced the horror firsthand, and his poem reflects his disdain for what he felt was an attempt to glorify the needless sacrifice of so many young lives. On passing the Menin Gate. Who will remember passing through the gate the unheroic dead who fed the guns? Who shall absolve the foulness of their fate, those doomed, conscripted, unvictorious ones? Crudely renewed, the salient holds its own. Paid are its dim defenders by this pomp, paid with a pile of peace-complacent stone, the armies who endured that sullen swamp. Here was the world's worst wound, and here with pride, their name liveth forever, the gateway claims. Was ever an immolation so belied as these intolerably nameless names? Well might the dead who struggled in the slime rise and deride this sepulchre of crime. This is, of course, Memorial Day weekend, which has become the unofficial beginning of the summer season. And when the weather is especially nice like today, it is understandable that folks want to get outside and celebrate life, perhaps cooking something outside on the grill. But tomorrow is also the time that our nation has set aside to remember those who died in military service and honor their sacrifice. It is a tradition that goes back to the end of the Civil War. Though several towns and cities lay claim to being the first to mark Memorial Day, honoring soldiers who fought on both sides of the Civil War began almost immediately after the war ended, with a so-called Decoration Day, when soldiers' graves were decorated with flowers and flags. The day became known in most states as Memorial Day by the 1880s and was celebrated on May 30th, regardless of the day of the week. After the First World War, it expanded to include those killed in all wars, and in 1971, Memorial Day received federal recognition. It was then that the last Monday in May was chosen, and many veterans groups have fought to revert to the May 30th date ever since, fearing the original focus on remembering the fallen has been overshadowed by the 3-day holiday weekend. Honoring the fallen is a practice that is at least thousands of years old, and it is probably as old as war itself. It was a common practice in ancient Greece and Rome, for example, and we even have the funeral oration of the Athenian leader Pericles from 431 BCE, celebrating those who were killed in the Peloponnesian War. Loss and grief are a fact of human nature, and we have been killing each other in battle for a very long time. The human cost of war is tragic, and it is right that we should honor those who gave their lives in America's military conflicts, regardless of how we feel about the moral justification of those conflicts, or even how we feel about warfare in general. But we should also remember the human toll on civilian populations, sometimes called collateral damage, to make it easier to dehumanize the reality of the men, women, and children whose lives were destroyed. In the Civil War, for example, an estimated 650,000 to 720,000 combatants were killed. And though it is hard to be accurate about civilian deaths, the toll is believed to be at least 50,000 and possibly as high as 400,000. Preserving the Union and freeing the slaves exacted a tremendous sacrifice. And the legacy of that conflict still echoes in the divisive politics and racism that persist to the present. As we mark another Memorial Day, America has armed forces of every service branch deployed around the world. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have had troops in harm's way for over 20 years, long enough for a new generation to be born and reach the age to serve alongside their parents in the same conflict. Meanwhile, in the Middle East and parts of Asia and Africa, they remain in constant violent turmoil, and a new round of hostilities between Israelis and Palestinians has erupted, killing more than 250 people, including at least 66 Palestinian children and 1 Israeli child. War seems inevitable and endless. And in so many places, violence begets violence for generations. I was watching a documentary about the First World War recently, and one of the historians remarked that Americans have never really acknowledged the First World War like some other conflicts because it did not fit neatly into the moral narrative of American wars. Though we claim to be fighting for democracy, that war seemed more like a European squabble between Queen Victoria's grandchildren that nobody expected to escalate into the profound human tragedy that it became. America tried to stay out of that conflict, but the temptation was just too great. And as I've been thinking lately about the First World War, along with our presence in the Middle East and the recent fighting in Israel and the West Bank, I am reminded all too well of how violence begets violence. So for this Memorial Day sermon, I now want to dig deeper into the legacy of the First World War as one example that is still haunting us more than 100 years later. I also want to point out how some of the nationalism and saber rattling we see in the West today is eerily similar to the conditions that led to that disastrous war. In 1888, during a time when nationalism was on the upswing and complex political alliances were being formed among the European nations, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck famously predicted that one day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans. History proved him right, of course, when Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated by Serbian nationalists on June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo, unleashing the chain of events that started the First World War. treaty obligations soon forced the powers of Europe into open conflict, and by August 1914, great armies began to clash in horrific battles over the next 4 years. It would result in the death of over 16 million soldiers and civilians, with another 20 million wounded physically or psychologically. It was a war that produced terrible new weapons and tactics that forever changed the way wars would be fought. Tanks, poison gas, and the aerial bombardment of cities, just to name a few. The carnage was so horrific, it is no wonder the First World War became known optimistically as the war to end all wars. As we know, sadly, this was not the case. In America, the First World War was initially seen as a European problem, although many Americans volunteered with European military units, such as the famous Lafayette Escadrille Squadron, some of the first fighter pilots in history. Airplanes had only existed for about a decade, but already human ingenuity turned them into killing machines. In our melting pot nation of immigrants, both sides of the conflict found supporters in America, but Germany and its allies were generally seen to be the aggressors. When a German U-boat sank the non-military ship RMS Lusitania without warning on May 7, 1915, killing 128 American citizens, public opinion really began to turn against Germany. But even so, America did not decide to enter the war until April 2, 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Wilson was committed to neutrality, but Germany's fate was sealed by the famous Zimmermann telegram in January 1917. In this intercepted communication, German agents tried to gain Mexico as an ally if America entered the war against Germany by promising to restore territory lost to the United States. The American public was outraged. America's entry into the war helped turn the tide, but at a high price. Roughly 117,000 Americans lost their lives, and most were laid to rest in the enormous cemeteries established near the battlefields. One such cemetery is located in Verdun, France, near the site of an ongoing series of fighting that lasted nearly 2 years. I visited that cemetery on a school trip when I was in prep school, where we hoped to locate the grave of a famous alumnus of our school. He was killed there on July 19, 1918. We were unable to locate his grave, but I remember being struck by the thousands of crosses in just this one cemetery. Each of them represented a life ended far too soon. Memorialized the inscription, Mort pour la France, dead for France. I have visited many other military cemeteries in America and in Normandy, and I think everyone should spend time in these hallowed places to gain perspective on the true cost of military conflict. War may be called politics by other means, but it is a deadly calculus that impacts families for generations. The geopolitical aftermath of the First World War was costly as well. The political chaos and poverty in war-ravaged Europe not only contributed to the rise of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, but it also left a profound legacy in the Middle East. The end of the war marked the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. With the Ottomans out of power, European colonial interests rushed into the Middle East, with Great Britain quickly becoming the greatest power in the region. The British became the de facto rulers of Egypt and Palestine, and soon created the nations of Iraq and Saudi Arabia to serve their own purposes, with little concern for the tribalism and religious differences of the people. With the European colonial occupation of the region came predictable brutality and oppression. Native people were often forced into subservient lives in the service of a foreign elite. In Egypt, a school teacher named Hassan al-Banna began to call for an end to occupation and a return to an egalitarian society based on the Islamic society in Medina that is described in the Quran. He started a social justice movement, which he called the Muslim Brotherhood. Perhaps you have heard of it. It started out as a positive, peaceful social movement. But after al-Banna's death and decades of its members being brutally oppressed by both foreign and Muslim rulers, it became more militant and fundamentalist. The Muslim Brotherhood survives today, of course, and Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and the ISIS militants in Iraq can all trace their origins to this once peaceful source. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the British authorities began laying the groundwork for what would become the unresolved conflict we see today. On November 2nd, 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour wrote the famous Balfour Declaration to Baron Walter Rothschild, who was a leader of the British Jewish community. The declaration said, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." With support from the British, diaspora Jews began immigrating to Palestine in larger numbers. Despite the assurances of the British, disputes over land rights began almost immediately with the non-Jewish communities already in place. At the end of the 19th century, an estimated 24,000 Jews lived in Palestine. By 1947, on the eve of the United Nations resolution that created the modern state of Israel, the Jewish population had swelled to around 600,000, with about twice as many Palestinians. Even so, the UN resolution called for 57% of the land to be designated Jewish and only 43% Palestinian. By 1947, people around the world sincerely wished to provide the Jewish people with a homeland in the aftermath of the Holocaust. But sometimes the familiar sting of anti-Semitism was a stronger motivator for Jews to emigrate. Some nations were all too happy to encourage their Jewish populations to return to Israel, and few people outside of Palestine truly cared about the plight of the Palestinians. Today, there are over 8 million residents in Israel, with Jews accounting for over 6 million, and the rest being Israeli Arabs, Christians, and others. In the Palestinian-controlled West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, there are an additional 4.1 million Palestinians, with almost half of them squeezed into the Gaza Strip. To give you a better understanding, Gaza is about 1/10 the size of Rhode Island, with almost twice the population. At 13,000 people per square mile, it is one of the most densely populated places on Earth, comparable to the urban centers of Boston and New York. When you hear about Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, think about what that would be like in such a densely populated place. It is no wonder that civilian casualties are so high. I have mentioned only a little of the history and politics of Israel-Palestine to provide some context, and the issues are so complex that any resolution seems impossible at times. Both Israelis and Palestinians have a narrative that must be heard if any progress is to be made. And right now, America seems reluctant to really hear the Palestinian story. Sporadic violence continues on both sides, and the distrust runs very deep. This is a lasting legacy of problems that the Western nations created in the aftermath of the First World War, despite our often good intentions. We would do well to remember this lesson. Another lesson to consider is the way treaty obligations and nationalism coalesced into the inevitable outbreak of the First World War. Today, once again, we see nationalism on the rise in many places. The Brexit vote in the UK, right-wing political gains in France, Russian nationalism used to justify Putin's expansionist ambitions in Ukraine and other former Soviet republics. In our own country, a disturbing number of people are willing to embrace racism, xenophobia, and religious intolerance in defining what it means to be a real American and make the country great again. Meanwhile, the mess in Syria and the reckless behavior of North Korea's leadership seems fraught with peril. Will the next great war come out of some damn fool thing in the Middle East or the Korean Peninsula? Tensions are high and alliances are complex. We've seen this before and no good came out of it. I have little faith that the world leaders will step back from the brink due to common sense, but let us hope that economic globalization has created enough vested financial interest among nations that it can provide checks on reckless unilateral actions. Maybe corporate greed has a positive side when it comes to international politics. But then again, there's lots of money to be made if a bigger war broke out. Only time will tell. War also appeals to our tribal instincts. Pacifism was a common position before America entered the First World War. But once we did, the ugly head of intolerance in the name of patriotism was soon revealed. One painful example from our own Unitarian history illustrates this nicely. Just a month after the United States entered the war, the U.S. and Canadian Unitarians held their annual General Conference in Montreal. A faction of the Unitarians, including a number of clergy, opposed the war, even though the vast majority supported it. The leader of those who opposed the war was the Reverend John Haynes Holmes, a prominent minister from New York City who helped found both the NAACP and the American Civil Liberties Union. Pretty strong credentials for our liberal faith. Knowing they were in the minority, Holmes and his supporters did not argue for Unitarians to oppose the war, but suggested that Unitarians should look to their avowed freedom of belief and opinion and work cooperatively toward a ministry of reconciliation that focused on peace. Holmes did make his own position on the war very clear, saying, "I am a pacifist, a non-resistant. I hate war, and I hate this war, and so long as I live, I will have nothing to do with this or any war." Leading the majority position in favor of the war was the president of that year's conference, William Howard Taft, a Unitarian layman and former president of the United States. Taft felt the American Unitarian Association should pass a strong resolution in support of the war effort. In the end, the General Conference did so, including a provision to withhold any support from member congregations whose ministers openly opposed the war. As a result, a number of ministers were forced to leave their congregations. Holmes left the American Unitarian Association in 1918 and only rejoined in 1960. At the 1936 General Assembly, the Unitarians expressed their regret at the way these ministers and congregations were treated and passed a resolution repudiating the actions as, quote, contrary to the fundamental Unitarian principles of freedom of thought and conscience. These days, when there is a lot of turmoil and tension in our denomination over the issue of racism and white supremacy and whether we have still too much institutional support of white privilege, I think we would do well to remember this ugly period in our history and beware of labeling each other as friend or foe. And even among Unitarian Universalists, the Israel-Palestine issue can be difficult. I have spoken with several UU seminarians and ministers over the years who have received very hostile reactions from congregants when they criticize the Israeli government's treatment of Palestinians, even when they have attempted to present both sides of the argument. For some people, it seems that criticizing Israel is synonymous with being anti-Semitic, or at least anti-Israel. I saw this on full display at our General Assembly in Columbus a few years ago when we failed to pass a resolution calling for financial divestment from Israeli companies who profit from the occupation of the West Bank. This is an unresolved conflict even within our own faith. If only the First World War had truly been the war to end all wars. Humanity seems hell-bent on repeating the violent mistakes of our past again and again. But just maybe we can start to learn from our mistakes. Over 100 years later, we still have troops in the Middle East and no sign of peace on the horizon. No matter how we feel about the wars our nation has fought in the past, or the ongoing conflicts we are engaged in around the world, this Memorial Day weekend, let us honor those who have served our nation's armed forces and remember all of those who gave their last full measure of devotion. It is patriotic to serve in our nation's armed forces, but it is also patriotic to challenge our government whenever our leaders call for military action and hold them accountable. Let us always work for peace and be mindful that our most patriotic feelings can lead us into behaviors we might later regret. Let us always remember the darkness and painful human cost of armed conflict, no matter how justified our cause may seem. I invite you to join in our next hymn, number 159, This Is My Song.
This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and the skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine.
Our closing words come from John Stuart Mill. War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things, the decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks that nothing is worth a war is much worse. When a people are used as mere human instruments for firing cannons or flourishing bayonets in the service and for the selfish purposes of a master, such war degrades the people. a war to protect other human beings against tyrannical injustice, a war to give victory to their own ideas of right and good, and which is their own war carried on for an honest purpose by their free choice, is often the means of their regeneration. A man who has nothing which he is willing to fight for, nothing which he cares more about than he does about his personal safety, is a miserable creature who has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself. As long as justice and injustice have not terminated their ever-renewing fight for their ascendancy in the affairs of mankind, human beings must be willing, when need is, to do battle for the one against the other.
We will now extinguish our chalice with the following words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please join us for our virtual coffee hour, which will be available in just a few minutes. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.